Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 7th chapter in the book of Acts. We have a lot of material in this chapter, about 3 lessons worth. It's one long sermon, and we're going to divide it in 3. The territory we're going to cover today is up to the 19th verse. Then we meet of Moses. So the one speaking, Stephen, gives a review and a history of the Jewish people, and the content of his preaching is motivated by the audience. They are still in Jerusalem, so there's a very Jewish emphasis on the preaching that we've been witnessing beginning in the 2nd chapter when Peter quotes Joel, David twice, and then he just he keeps referencing scripture throughout because they're preaching to a Jewish people, so they had the law, the prophets, and the writings, and they are witnessing some of the promises in the prophecies unfolding, and they're laying claim hold to it. But in the 6th chapter, which comes before the chapter we're going to cover, the church is in growth pains. They're expanded. They were 3,000 at Pentecost. They have now gone beyond 5,000, and the problem is that Grecian widows were being neglected for the provision of their welfare. No one's faults, but the institutional emergence of the office of deacon is born of necessity, so that the apostles shall give ourselves continually to prayer and to serving the word. So our ministry is to tend to the spiritual welfare of the flock. We have people and other people who can take care of the temporal stuff for us. If you are a pastor, though, that does not mean that you don't have oversight and you have to be aware of what's going on. But it's only to say that ministers, we stay grounded in the word. We live the word, we preach the word, we teach the word. And the word pleased the entire group, and they chose Stephen, a man filled with faith, in the Ruach Kadesh, and then he's the first of the 7 named in the 5th verse, and then we read more of him in the 8th verse. And Stephen, filled with faith and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. So besides being a renowned preacher, the material in the 7th chapter is really nothing short of fantastic. But he was also a miracle worker, so it wasn't just the apostles to whom the ministry of miracles was given. And Philip also came into Samaria. He's the second named of the apostles, and we read of his exploits in the 8th chapter. But in the, these people are against him. They see what he's doing, but they were unable to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. So these antagonists tried to do something, but they were powerless to do it because of the power and the wisdom. He had an irresistible force with the words that he spoke. He knew how to handle the room. He knew what they were saying. And so what they do is they can't beat him in open debate, so they resort to a whispering campaign. And this whispering campaign eventually evolves into a libelous claim made in a tribunal. And they presented false witnesses who said, "This man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this temple or the Torah." So they charged him with going after the temple and Moses and the law of Moses. So that was the nature of their charge, that this man was an enemy. And for we have heard him saying that this Yahshua of Nazareth shall overthrow this place and change the institutes which Moses delivered unto us. So their concern is that he was preaching the literal extreme, which they could have interpreted the Messiah's declaration to tear down this temple in 3 days and I shall build another. So that kind of got terribly interpreted and just resonated in these people's heads. But he didn't change the law. The law is still binding. He rendered one part of the absolute obsolete. The ceremonial, the sacrificial element of the law was one and done. And the Jewish system would cease with the destruction of the temple some 35 years later at this point. Yeah, they're in the year 34 or 35. But this takes us, and he's addressing the council. This would have been the Sanhedrin. These would have been, or the people, the local people there. We don't know quite where he is. He might have been in, where was he? He might have been in Cilicia, I remember. So Paul may have been at one of these places. Anyways, his face exudes the appearance of an angel, so he has an ethereal quality surrounding him as he's addressing these men. And the high priest, first verse, 7th chapter, book of Acts, lesson itself, and the high priest said, "Is this so?" So what he wants to know is the charges that were leveled against him, speaking blasphemous words against Moses and Elohim, and also saying that he was following one who was going to overthrow the institutes of Moses and just dismantle our entire religious establishment. And he replied, "Men, brothers, and fathers, listen. The Elohim of esteem appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Aram, Nea, before he dwelt in Haran." So he's saying that he's the most Jewish person in the room. He's reminding them of their history. These men are not children of Abraham. If they were children of Abraham, they would have followed this line, but they are part of the people who are exemplified in the material we're going to cover today by Joseph's brothers. The Israelites had an abysmal habit of betraying the best among them, of killing the prophets, just like they tried to kill Joseph's brothers, tried to kill him. And then that leads up to the today portion, the third portion of the chapter, where the middle portion is Moses and the final portion is Joshua, all the way till today. He's referencing Genesis 12, when Abraham, when he was a citizen of Ur, there was an advanced city by the standards of the day. Certainly, it was founded by the Mesopotamians. So he was a civilized people, called to be a wandering nomad. Before he dwelt in Haran. Haran would have been the Chaldea is what it's alternately called. So this is the region to the south of Babylon, which by connection called that. And when he was there, he was said to him, "Come out of your land and from your relatives and come here into a land that I shall show you." So this was a promise that if he he left everything now, he would pack up his stuff and leave and become a father of a nation in a land that the voice who called him to would lead him there and guide him through. And he will sire a child of promise, through whom, whether he looks up at the sky, he has a reminder of the nation that will come from his loins, or the sand and the sea. Then he came out of the land of the Castites and dwelt in Haran, and from there unto the death of his father he removed him to his land, in which you now dwell. So the death of his father, he was the son of Tehran. We read of him in the 11th chapter of Genesis. We also read that he was 70 years old when he sired his sons, and Abram is the first at that list, but he also died when he was 205 years old. Abraham was called when he was 75 years old, so this may have been when he died, so there may have been a 60-year gap between Abram's oldest brother. They're not presented in the order in which they were born, is what I'm trying to say. So this all lines up. There's no contradiction. We just want to get that out of the way. And we also hear him use the word 400 years. That's just, he's rounding it down. The literal length was 430, but he's just, he mathematical precision was not as the ancients were as obsessed with it as some of us moderns are. And he gave him no inheritance in it, not a foot of it, but he promised to give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. So Abraham was not a nation. He was a wandering nomad who had, 318 servants, so he was a man of some means and some influence. And he was, he did wield his clout in the geopolitical struggle of the cities, where the battle in the 14th chapter of Genesis, but he dwelled in the land, and he had the promise of the land, but he did not possess it. So all the while he was clinging to a promise he could not hold, a promise he could not see, a promise he could only grasp by faith. So he obeyed unto the promise, and he was blessed. His seed after him, that is the progeny of Isaac through Jacob, through and then the rest. And Elohim spoke in this way, that his seed would be sojourning in a foreign land, and that they should be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. This takes us to Genesis 15, where that number is also 400 years. He was just rounding down. It was exactly 430 years, but this is consistent with what we read. So he told him, he had this fantastic promise, but he told him that the significance of the nation that he was to sire was to be as a redeemed people. So they were to be enslaved and in bondage until they were literally liberated into a promised land, to land of milk and honey. There was literally no place like Israel on earth, but first they had to go through the ringer. So for 430 years, and we read the reason why they get it. So even before the patriarchs' children and progeny are led down to Egypt. Abraham had the promise that they would remain there for 430 years, where they would be enslaved. And the nation to whom they shall be enslaved I shall judge, said Elohim, and after that they shall come up and serve me in this place. That nation was judged in the 10 plagues that visited upon them, the range of which, the first of which was turning the Nile into blood, the final of which was the death of the firstborn, all the way from the Pharaoh down to the cattle in their dockyard. And the clear mark of protection lay on Abraham's progeny. Even though they were enslaved, they had a divine being working on their behalf, and he accomplished their redemption finally at the Red Sea. But that's not the direction that he takes this. He emphasizes the covenant. He's going through history, so from Abraham he passes down to Isaac, and then from there to Jacob, then Joseph, and then Moses is going to come in the material we're going to cover after this. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so he brought forth Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac Jacob, and Jacob the 12 ancestors. So the circumcision was the signal of their belonging to this community. It was a mark that sealed them to Yahweh, and the physical rite became especially prized and obsessive about as a result of the notorious tyrant Antiochus IV, who ruled from Syria, the Hellenistic tyrant with a serious god complex, who stopped these so that's why they were obsessed with it by the New Testament time. But it was, a mark of an identity, and Abraham was circumcised when he was 99 years old. Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day, and that's been the custom ever since. But Paul uses the fact that he wasn't circumcised when he was called. He was called by faith, not by the law, because he wasn't circumcised till the 99th year. But that was their mark of identity, and the physical one anyway. And the ancestors, becoming jealous, sold Joseph into Egypt, but Elohim was with him. So Joseph's brothers are emblematic of the masses, and the mobs who had killed the prophets and the powers that be, the rulers that consented to their death. And we read that Paul is in their ranks when he consents to. Stephen is the first Messianic martyr in the faith, so he is the first to shed blood for the new faith. But blood is the seed, the field on which the church grows. It's the seed that causes the growth, in a sense. So there were a lot of martyrs. It was a fact of life, and there are Christian martyrs in the world right now. The world has not stopped killing us since we've been around. It's just a fact of life in Christian history. But that motive of envy is the root of all evil, is a saying of the world, not necessarily in Scripture, but it's certainly true with Joseph's brothers. And he did forgive them because it was all part of providence, and he knew he was in God's hand and God's path, and so it was necessary for them to betray him and sell him into slavery to Egypt, because from there his dream interpreting ability landed him an audience with the Pharaoh, who took an instant liking to him and exalted him to the second in command. And there his family's influence and well-being was secured, because they came down because the famine hit them, the famine that Joseph had predicted in the dream of Pharaoh. So that brought them down there, and it was all part of providence. Because Elohim was with him, and that we find that often in the Genesis account of him. And delivered him out of all his afflictions, and gave him grace and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he appointed him governor over Egypt and all his house. So the story how this happened is Joseph found himself in prison for a fallacious rape allegation. He refused the sexual advances of his master's mistress, who tried to seduce him, and then he refused it, and she cried rape, landing him in prison. There he meets two employees of the Pharaoh, a baker and a candlestick maker, and they both have dreams which signal, as Joseph interprets, that the Pharaoh's going to kill one of them, and he's going to release and restore the other one. And in 3 days it comes to pass, and this man, he tells him to make mention of him to Pharaoh, but he doesn't. So he until Pharaoh has a disturbing dream of 7 skinny cows, 7 fat cows followed by 7 skinny cows, which was that in 7 years you're going to have plenty, but to store it and keep it because there's going to be 7 years of drought and famine after this. and the land around Egypt was certainly affected by it. That's what drew the family down there. So before they were a nation, they were a family, and they became a nation within a nation from the family. And then a famine of food and great distress came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no food. So the fathers are separate from Joseph right now. They thought they got rid of him, and they thought he was a goner, but little do they know they call begging to him, and they are bowing for him, just as the dream indicated in the 37th chapter. He has a dream which disturbs his brothers, where him and even his fathers are bowing down to him, the stars, and that provokes their more or less perpetual envy. But then they, do regret killing him, especially trying to. They originally tried to kill him, but then they, through Reuben's intervention, settled for selling them into slavery to Ishmaelite slave traders rolling around the way. But then they're in a land with no food, and he is in a land with food because of his own prudence, his own ability to interpret prophecy, and his own ability to administer a plan in response to the prophetic prompting. But Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, and he sent out our fathers the first time. So this is the original expedition when Jacob remains in the promised land with Benjamin, and he sends Benjamin is the final of the 12 sons, the youngest of the one, born of Leah, his beloved, or Rachel rather, the one he loved greater than them, but she died in childbirth having him, so he kept him behind. And the other 11, Joseph holds one of them hostage, saying, "Bring back your younger brother," because he puts on this whole, they don't recognize him because he's in command and control, and they are bowing to him. But he does kind of toy with them and play games with his power, and then it ultimately leads to their restoration and forgiveness. They were worried that he was going to kill them as soon as their father died, but it's a beautiful story of forgiveness. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's race became known to the Pharaoh. So once Joseph made himself known to the brothers were in Egypt. They brought down their families and settled their stuff and procreated and created tribes unto themselves in another nation of Egypt. And the Pharaoh gets to know Joseph's race. Joseph is beloved and treasured and esteemed. He is second in authority and command and control to Pharaoh himself. He has the good graces of all the ones he comes across, whether it's Potiphar, the guard. He's elevated, and then in prison he's elevated to the custodian of the prisoners. And at the second time Joseph was made, and Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So there's actually 70 in the Hebrew Bible, but in the Greek, the Septuagint, there are 75. There are two additional listed sons of Manasseh and Ephraim, the children of Joseph, and they both have a grandson, so that puts the number at 5. So there is once more no inconsistency. That's the way they translated it in the Hebrew from the Greek. And Jacob went down to Egypt and died, and he and our fathers. So this takes place in the 49th chapter of Genesis is his parting words. Then we read of his burial in the 50th chapter. They go to great pains and great lengths to keep him buried in the designated location that he has determined. But eventually his family just gets kind of sucked into Egypt, and then eventually they're enslaved. They could have succumbed to idolatry and just went after these deities in their land, and that could have been the punishment for it. Or it was just part of the plan and providence to inflict misery and oppression upon his people in order that they might be redeemed and have these spiritual treasures and privileges of being a covenant nation. And they were brought over to Shechem and led in the tomb that Abraham bought for the price of silver from the son of Hamor of Shechem. This Hamor was Hittite by descent, and this was the land, the burial plot that Abraham had purchased for his own self, and that was where the bones of Isaac and Jacob were also laid. So this location would have been familiar to them, but it means nothing to us, but it is important to know for the sake of detail. But as the time of the promise nears, which Elohim swore to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt. So they were becoming a nation. They were growing into a nation. The problem is they had a host nation, and this host nation, what happened in Egypt, the most likely most plausible historical scenario was the restoration of the native Egyptians in the new kingdom. And so when Joseph came down, it was in all likelihood when the Hyksos, these were foreigners who had horses, the Egyptians had nothing like them, so they just swooped in and conquered them instantaneously. And but then the Egyptians learned how to use horses, and they took command and control of their country back from these foreign interlopers. And what happened is that with the rise of nationalism came a wave of xenophobia. So the Pharaoh looked at this nation within the nation. He didn't know who they were, the one who, he wasn't of the same line and lineage of the Pharaoh who had exalted Joseph to the second in command across the land. And they enslaved them for a period of 430 years, to be exact, by the Exodus account that is rounded down to 400 in this and in Genesis. Until another king arose who did not know Joseph. This we read of in Exodus 1:8. It's a familiar phrase. Now, precisely who this Pharaoh was, the most likely one was Ahmose I, the founder of the new kingdom of Egypt, and Egypt became an empire. And so they were no longer an isolated nation protecting its own bask on the Nile. They were immersed in the war of empire, and they would remain all the way up till the Babylonian power struggle between them and Assyria, which Babylon set the course for the age of the Gentiles. And having dealt treacherously with our race, this one mistreated our fathers, making them expose their children so that they should not live. So even once enslaved, they just couldn't stop procreating. This blessed, Abraham, who was past the child-giving age, and his wife was past the childbearing age. He had these seeds that just kept flourishing. So even when they were enslaved, they kept multiplying, and the Pharaoh got nervous. He said, there's too many, they're breeding too quickly, we got to kill the most recent borns. And that's what happens to Moses. He is sent on a basket, and the rest is history. And he does carry Moses' biography all the way to the 44th verse. That's the one we'll take after this. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.